Order! Order! You are an incorrigible delinquent at times. Behave yourself, man!
And now from paperless to the papers, as usual. Lots of Europe on the front pages. That story you've just been hearing about in the Sunday Telegraph about a Tory grassroots revolt against the Prime Minister. The Sunday Times, in a very different mood, has got Margaret Thatcher would vote yes to EU, it says. She's, of course, dead. This is one of her closest advisers, Lord Pole, ventriloquising for her. Lord Tebbit disagrees with that analysis. We are not going to talk about the rugby today for obvious reasons. Even though it's all over the front of the Observer as well. A very interesting story about people in lower-income families who are going to have to pay more to stay in social housing in the south in particular. That looks like being a very, very big story just beginning to build. That's what the Observer's splashing on. Then there's the Mail on Sunday, a disturbing story about Help for Heroes, the charity. They say there's a probe and problems there. And also Priti Patel, the latest cabinet minister who is coming out against the EU. We're told that she's trying to meet the Prime Minister to explain why, possibly even today. So a lot, Isabel and Gabby, to talk about. Who's going to kick us off?
Well, I've got two stories on page 2 of The Sun on Sunday, which are about Europe. Surprise, surprise. One is about whether Michael Gove will join the Out campaign or the In campaign. Apparently he's genuinely torn, and it quotes as saying, this is haunting him more than usual.
See, I heard that there's a story on the front of the Times saying Michael Gove is thought to be very, very torn, doesn't know which to do. And I kind of read that as Michael Gove's last kind of goodbye to his Brexit friends, Dominic Cummings, before he lines up with the Prime Minister. Do you think I'm wrong about that? Or?
Well, I think a lot of cabinet ministers are thinking about their personal loyalty to David Cameron. This is the problem also for Tory MPs. They, yes. Particularly actually Tory backbenchers, who feel that David Cameron won them their seats last May, and they're very disappointed by the deal that he's brought back. But actually, in the final analysis, they're struggling to work out whether they can really bring themselves to go against him and back Brexit.
And there's a picture here of David Cameron as the Godfather, which is not my immediate image of the Prime Minister, I have to say, but
it's one of these wonderful graphics that The Sun does, which is basically David Cameron and George Osborne are alleged by lots of people in the Conservative Party to be leaning a little bit too heavily on some of their ministerial colleagues and on backbenchers as well, sort of dropping hints about their future careers and also really trying to drum up support for the renegotiation deal that Cameron brought back last week. Cameron hasn't got that many ministers supporting him on that, really. Making
Boris an offer he can't refuse. And Gabby, Boris is also quite heavily involved in the spread that you've got there. That's the Mail on Sunday, I think, is that right?
Yes, the Mail on Sunday is very disappointed that Boris has proved insufficiently Eurosceptic.
Just tell us the story behind that, because it's quite fun.
It was actually Priti Patel I was more interested in with this one, but it's...
So this is Boris in the House of Commons, sitting beside...
sitting beside another MP and saying, when he sat down having said his piece, but aren't you a Eurosceptic? Are you wimping out on out? And he says, I was never an outer. And that's kind of like, whoa, well, in that case, why were you flirting? Yeah. Why were you flirting and with out and giving the impression that you would maybe be out, maybe not? And actually, to be honest, I mean, looking back at Boris's history, he has never been an overt outer. He has always been on the side of sort of criticising the EU and wanting to reform the EU and sounding off against the EU, but he's never been an overt outer, and it's not a huge surprise.
And this, viewers, is very important because really Gove and Boris are the two big Tory beasts. We don't really know which side they're going to come down on. So those are the last two to be fought for.
And yet it feels as if momentum is moving towards it. And that leaves us with Priti Patel as the only sort of vaguely prominent minister at this stage who looks like she might take up the cudgels, and particularly the only female outer, because at the moment the Out campaign is incredibly
Ian Duncan
male.
Smith and Bernard Jenkins.
It's largely old men in suits, and I think the problem for the Out campaign with that is that the biggest proportion of undecided voters are female, and we know that from the Scottish referendum. It was women it came down to in the end, and to have a female figurehead is really important.
So Priti Patel, and on the other side, Kate Hoey, Gisela Stewart on the Labour side, these are going to be very important figures.
And of course Theresa May not quite announced yet, but it looks as if she's going to be.
And another very important figure, but certainly not a female figure, is Nigel Farage in the Sunday Telegraph there, I think.
Yes, well, he's given an interview saying that he's got the voice to persuade the undecideds. And this is all part of the battle between the many Leave campaigns who all want designation from the Electoral Commission to be the official campaign that gets a little bit more funding and broadcast time as well. Farage basically is obviously quite a divisive figure, and some of those in the Vote Leave camp, which is one of the Eurosceptic campaigns, think that he's too divisive.
Vote Leave are kind of more Tories and so forth, yeah.
Well, they do have some Labour people on board, but just to make it a little bit more confusing, the few Labour Eurosceptics who are involved in the campaign to leave are split, not just over whether to join Vote Leave, but over whether they've left Vote Leave. And there was a big row about whether or not...
So there needs to be a new campaign called leave.leave.org.
There are so many leaves, it's like autumn at the moment. It's very confusing.
Very good, yes.
So
so he's saying, I can reach out, I can be the guy who finds these undecided voters. And this is quite important, because it's a question of what sort of campaign it's going to be. Is it going to be all about immigration, or is it going to be optimistically about the economy? So it really does matter, even though it's kind of slightly difficult and boring at the moment.
Yeah. And UKIP is also split over which campaign to join as well, just to make it
MP,
even more confusing.
He's not split in himself, I don't think.
Give it time, probably.
Give it time. So, Gabby, this really important story in The Observer, just tell us what it's about.
This feels like the new bedroom tax. You know, it's got that sense of something that seemed a bit technical when government first announced it, but you sense it really blowing up into a political battle now. So you have this policy which basically is asking people who are in council housing at the moment and who earn more than $30,000 a year will be expected to take their chances on the open market to move and rent privately. And there's a piece of research suggesting that actually in the southeast, because rents are now so high, 50% of those people affected aren't going to be able to afford to rent on the private market. So you have a situation where council housing becomes a sort of refuge for the desperate, really only an emergency safety net. And a lot of other people are left with a caught between two things, you know, no longer too wealthy, supposedly, to be in social housing, but not wealthy enough to afford
So this is about
rent.
people like policemen, firemen, NHS workers who are currently in council housing. They're going to be forced out.
When you're talking about people with a household income of $30,000 a year, that might be two people each earning $15,000. That's not a lot of money in which to find, you know, alternative accommodation in the southeast. And there's obviously the housing bill is in the House of Lords this week, so one feels it's going to develop now into a big political battle.
I'm reasonably switched in. I had never heard of this policy before. Is it new?
Well, it was actually announced. It was first announced in 2011, and there have been rows about it ever since. But it's interesting they don't seem to have quite got the design of this policy quite right yet, given they've had so long to work on it.
Well, in 2011, the thing was that the threshold was being set at 60,000. The household income was 60,000, and people were saying, actually, quite right. Why should people on that kind of money be in council housing?
Oh, I remember. This was a trade union leader.
Yes,
and
it was
so
the Bob Crow story.
It was,
yes.
But now, you know, now suddenly the threshold is half that, and in the intervening years, rents in London particularly have spiralled way out of control. So, you know, you do really get the feeling one of the big opponents in the Lords is Bob Kerslake, who's former head of the civil service. These are not the kind of people that government can easily dismiss as bleeding heart critics.
Right. Well, there's Margaret Thatcher from the grave saying she'd back the Prime Minister. Very useful for the Prime Minister. But let's move on to another big story from the Sunday Times about stillborn babies, Isabel.
Yes,
because this is their front page story and it's big investigation.
Yes, lots of papers have been picking up on this recently. The UK has got a really terrible rate of stillbirths. It's behind Slovenia and Slovakia for the number of babies that are stillborn. And it's something that MPs have become very concerned about. They've set up an all-party group on this, involving MPs such as Will Quince, who've lost babies themselves. And it's something that the ministers are getting more interested in as well. But the Sunday Times are doing a campaign basically on the different measures that are needed to...
Do we know why Britain has such a bad record? Is there any explanation?
There are various problems with the monitoring of the baby, with extra scans, which other countries have as well. There's a campaign called Count the Kicks, which encourages mothers to basically keep an eye on the movements of their baby as they go into the later stages of pregnancy as well.
Yes, but it's a reminder almost of the cot death campaign in the 80s and 90s, that sense that, you know, we had a problem that we didn't quite know how to deal with, and yet there were simple measures that you could take that radically reduced the number of cot deaths.
And a withering personal story there for Judith O'Reilly, who was the colleague of many of us in the lobby before she went up to the north of England. Very sad story. And another health story there, Gabby, you picked up, the sugar tax.
We're going to hear from Jamie Oliver later about Wither, the sugar tax. But this is a story from The Independent, which interviewed the government's former obesity czar, Dr. Susan Jebb, who says not only who has her doubts about the strategy, not just about dropping the sugar tax, but also about why are we focusing on fat children? You know, fat adults are also a problem, and adults, as parents, you know, dictate their children's diet and choices.
It hasn't been dropped. We just don't know what's going to happen to it.
Well, it hasn't been dropped, but the thinking, I'm sure Jeremy Hunt may fill us in later, but the thinking seems to be that the sugar tax is off the menu, that there's much more focus on content of sugar in food and regulating that, and on cracking down on junk food advertising on telly. I think most people who have kids will know that actually telly is almost not the problem anymore. I think it's children consume a lot more media now online. You know, my son watches YouTube. He doesn't watch television nearly as much as I used to as a kid. And I think, you know, there is a real problem in that space about how you control and regulate sugar marketing.
Right, good. Well, as you say, we'll hear more about that later on. Another very important, interesting story, rising costs put a third of Britain's curry houses at risk of closure.
Yes, we're going on from the obesity crisis and problems with portion sizes to the curry crisis. And this is awful because when I first heard about the curry crisis, I thought, right, this is clearly a call for me to go and eat more curry. But it's not just a problem of a lack of demand. There isn't a lack of demand for curry in Britain. It's actually a lack of skilled chefs because of immigration rules. And so there are fewer chefs coming in to make our curries. So it's not even as if we're not eating enough.
Terrible story. Gabby.
Yes.
Jeremy Corbyn now.
Indeed. This is a story about Labour's ongoing civil war over Trident, which has been running almost as long as the Tories' long-running war over Europe, and suggesting that if, as expected, Jeremy Corbyn adopts a policy of opposition to the renewal of Trident, some Labour MPs will be happy. Dozens of Labour MPs will go into the next election promising that they personally will be pro-Trident. So you have a sort of breakaway movement of Labour MPs saying, actually, we're not going to the country with a policy we regard as completely toxic and unelectable. We're expecting in the next few days Emily Thornberry to set out Labour's position on Trident. Not a great surprise, but I think this row's going to blow up this week.
Now, I've been filing the newspapers very carefully on the floor, which causes a problem, Isabel, because I want to talk about the Scottish health story, which is there somewhere, I suspect.
Yes.
And you can describe what it is while I search for it.
It's in the Independent on Sunday, which is that the SNP are trying to, it is in that part somewhere, it's trying to woo English doctors over the border.
So the Scottish government are going online with social media adverts saying, English doctors, come to us. It's nicer up here.
Yes, and I wonder how much of it is actually about NHS delivery and how much of it is just really a sort of political game designed to goad the Tories in England. I suspect it's quite a lot of the latter.
A lot of the latter, but of course in Scotland they are not subject to the same contract as the English doctors are fighting about. Thank you both very much. We covered a lot of space.